Automatics have a reputation problem in this country. People assume they're expensive to fix, expensive to run, and destined to fail the moment the warranty runs out. For most automatics, that reputation is fair. For the 9 I'm about to show you, it isn't. Nobody buys them because of a badge, a rumor, or simply because they've never heard of them. And that's exactly why they're still running, quietly, decades after everyone else's clever choice broke down. Let's get into it. Number 1. The Toyota Avensis, the second generation with the 2.0 petrol and Toyota's own 4-speed automatic gearbox, not the CVT that came later. Nobody has ever wanted an Avensis for its personality, because it doesn't have one. That's the entire point. Toyota built this as a company car, designed for people who drive 30,000 miles a year and need absolutely nothing to go wrong, ever. The automatic gearbox paired with it is a conventional torque converter unit, not some overcomplicated dual-clutch system trying to save fuel at the expense of durability, and it shows in how these age. I've had these through with 280,000 miles. Gearbox never touched beyond a fluid change, still shifting as smoothly as the day it left the factory. The interior looks like it was designed by someone actively trying not to be noticed, and that's fine because you're not buying this for the interior. You're buying it because it will start every single morning, without exception for the next 15 years. Watch for the timing chain tensioner on early examples of this generation, a known but manageable weak point, and make sure the automatic fluid has actually been changed at some point, rather than left as factory fill for 200,000 miles. Get that right, and this is one of the most boringly reliable automatics on sale in Britain for less than the price of a good mountain bike. Number 2. The Honda Accord, the 7th generation, with the 2.0 petrol and Honda's 5-speed automatic. Honda's automatic gearboxes from this era get overshadowed by their manuals, because Honda built a reputation on engines that like to be revved, and automatics don't really let you do that in the way enthusiasts wanted. But the actual gearbox itself, mechanically, is superbly engineered, built with the same obsessive precision Honda put into everything else during this period, and it simply does not wear out under normal use. I picked one of these up 18 months ago from a retired teacher who'd owned it from new, 140,000 miles, and the gearbox shifted with a precision that newer cars costing 5 times as much would struggle to match. Nobody's chasing these at auction. Nobody's writing forum posts about how brilliant they are. They're simply sitting there ignored, doing exactly what they were built to do. Check for a slight delay in kickdown response on cold mornings, which is normal on this transmission and not a fault, and confirm the fluid has been serviced roughly every 60,000 miles. Beyond that, this is a car that will disappear into your daily life so completely you'll eventually forget it's capable of anything remarkable at all, which is precisely the highest compliment I can give it. Number 3. The Mazda 6, the first generation, with the automatic gearbox paired to the 2.0 petrol. Mazda spent the 2000s trying to convince Britain it built genuinely engaging cars, and largely succeeded with the manual versions, which meant the automatics got quietly ignored by everyone chasing the sportier badge appeal. That neglect turned out to be lucky for anyone who actually bought one, because prices on these have stayed on the floor for over a decade, despite the mechanical reality underneath being thoroughly sound. I've seen these do 200,000 miles on the original gearbox with nothing more than fluid changes, the engine remaining smooth and untroubled the entire time. The styling has aged better than most cars from this era too, which is a strange bonus for something nobody's actually paying attention to when they're shopping. Watch for the rear subframe on higher mileage examples, a known corrosion point worth inspecting properly before purchase, and make sure the gearbox hasn't been left with degraded fluid for its entire life, since that's the single biggest predictor of problems on any automatic. Solve for those 2 things, and you've bought one of the most overlooked reliable automatics of its generation for genuinely spare change. A quick thought, not a request, just something worth sitting with. Every car on this list got quietly outsold by something flashier at the time, and every single one of them is still working while most of what outsold it has already gone to scrap. That pattern isn't coincidence. It's worth remembering next time a badge convinces you before the mechanics do. Number 4. The Lexus IS200, with Toyota's own automatic gearbox shared across the Lexus and Toyota range of the era. People assume Lexus means expensive to maintain, purely because of the badge sitting above a Toyota mechanical foundation. It's the opposite. Underneath that badge is Toyota Engineering, with an extra layer of quality control applied. And the automatic gearbox in this particular model is essentially bulletproof, built during a period when Lexus was desperately trying to prove itself against German rivals and had every incentive to overbuild rather than cut costs. I've had customers drive these past 200,000 miles with nothing beyond routine servicing. The gearbox shifting as cleanly at that mileage as it did when new. Nobody associates the IS200 with reliability, specifically because nobody associates it with anything at all. It exists in a strange blind spot where the badge should command respect, but somehow never quite gets it in the used market. Check for a whine from the differential on higher mileage examples, a known but not particularly expensive fault to resolve, and verify basic service history exists, since a genuinely neglected example is rare but not impossible to find. Solve for that, and you've got Lexus reliability standards for the price most people spend replacing a kitchen worktop. Number 5. The Volvo S60, the first generation, with the automatic gearbox, and the 2.4 petrol engine. Volvo's reputation for safety somehow never translated into a reputation for mechanical reliability in the public imagination, despite the actual engineering underneath being genuinely excellent throughout this era. The automatic gearbox, paired with the naturally aspirated petrol engine in particular, is one of the most under-stressed, overbuilt combinations Volvo ever put into production. Largely because Volvo assumed Scandinavian winters and built with enormous margins for error as standard practice. I bought one of these from an estate sale 2 years ago, 190,000 miles. Full service history, and the gearbox has since covered another 20,000 miles without a single complaint. The interior has that specific Volvo solidity to it that never quite goes out of fashion even as it stops looking modern. All thick plastics and switches that click with genuine mechanical satisfaction, rather than the flimsy feel most modern interiors have adopted. Watch for the timing belt interval, which is genuinely critical on this engine and must never be stretched beyond schedule. And check underneath for rust on the rear subframe mounting points, a known weakness worth inspecting properly. Beyond that, this is Scandinavian over-engineering sold at a price that reflects nothing but unfashionable styling and a badge people underestimate constantly. Number 6. The Subaru Legacy, with the automatic gearbox and the naturally aspirated 2.0 flat-4 engine, avoiding the turbocharged variants if long-term simplicity is the priority. Subaru built a reputation in Britain almost entirely around rally-bred turbocharged performance, which meant the ordinary naturally aspirated automatics got completely overlooked by a public that either wanted the turbo excitement or didn't want a Subaru at all. That overshadowing left genuinely excellent, under-stressed engines and gearboxes sitting quietly at rock-bottom prices for years. I've seen these do genuinely absurd mileages. 250,000 miles and beyond, the symmetrical all-wheel drive system and the simple naturally aspirated engine combining into something that just doesn't seem to wear out under normal use. Nobody's excited about buying one. That lack of excitement is the entire reason the price stays low enough to make sense. Check the head gaskets on any Subaru Flat 4 before committing, since that's the known weakness across the range, regardless of generation. But a well-maintained, naturally aspirated example with documented history rarely suffers from it in practice. Solve for that single check, and you've bought genuinely rally-proven engineering for family car money. Number 7. The Citroën C5, the first generation, with the automatic gearbox and the 2.0 petrol, avoiding the hydropneumatic suspension models if simplicity matters more to you than ride comfort. Citroën's reputation for unreliability in Britain is largely built on the complex hydraulic suspension systems the brand became famous for. And that reputation, fairly or not, bled into how people perceive everything else Citroën ever built, including engines and gearboxes that had absolutely nothing to do with the suspension complexity. Find a C5 with the simpler conventional suspension setup, and you strip away almost the entire source of Citroën's bad reputation while keeping a genuinely comfortable, well-built family car underneath. I picked one of these up for next to nothing 3 years ago, specifically because the seller assumed a suspension warning light meant catastrophic expense. It was a sensor. The gearbox and engine have since covered another 30,000 miles without a single unscheduled repair, proving the point rather neatly. Check specifically which suspension system any example has before buying, since this is the single detail that determines the entire ownership experience, and get basic service history confirmed on the automatic gearbox. Beyond that, you're buying French comfort and genuine mechanical soundness for a price entirely determined by a stigma that has nothing to do with what's actually under the bonnet. Number 8. The Nissan Primera, the second generation, with the automatic gearbox and the 2.0 petrol engine. This is possibly the most anonymous car on this entire list, a vehicle so thoroughly unremarkable that most people couldn't identify one in a car park, even if their livelihood depended on it. That anonymity, though, was built on genuinely sound Japanese engineering. From an era when Nissan was fighting hard to establish credibility in the European market and had every reason to overbuild rather than compromise. I've had these through with mileages well past 200,000. The automatic gearbox never having needed anything beyond fluid changes. The engine running with the kind of quiet competence that never makes headlines, but consistently gets people where they need to go. Nobody's ever bought a Primera because they wanted one, specifically. They bought it because it was cheap and it worked, and years later it's still doing exactly that. Watch for general corrosion on the rear arches given the age of most surviving examples, and confirm the automatic fluid has been changed at reasonable intervals rather than ignored entirely. Solve for those basics, and this remains one of the most underrated, genuinely dependable automatics from its entire era. Priced accordingly low, purely because nobody remembers it exists. Number 9, and I've kept this one for last because it's the one people find hardest to believe. The Saab 9-5, with the automatic gearbox and the naturally aspirated 2.3 petrol engine, avoiding the turbocharged variants for maximum simplicity. Saab's reputation in Britain now is tied up entirely with the company's eventual collapse. And that collapse has colored how people view every Saab that still exists on the road, as though financial failure somehow retroactively made the engineering worse. It didn't. The naturally aspirated engine and automatic gearbox combination in the 9-5 was built during a period when Saab still had genuine aerospace-influenced engineering discipline running through the company, and it shows in how understressed and durable this particular combination turned out to be. I bought one of these from a collector's estate 18 months ago, purely out of curiosity, expecting problems given the brand's reputation. There weren't any. 170,000 miles, full history, and the gearbox shifted with a precision that genuinely surprised me given everything I'd been led to expect. That car has since done another 10,000 miles without a single complaint, quietly proving every assumption about the brand wrong in the process. Check specifically for the turbocharged variant versus the naturally aspirated one. Since the turbo models carry genuine complexity, the naturally aspirated version simply doesn't have, and confirm parts availability locally before committing, since specialist knowledge is thinner on the ground than it used to be. Solve for those two things, and you've bought aerospace-adjacent Swedish engineering for a price that reflects a company's bankruptcy rather than the actual quality of what they built. 9 cars. All of them ignored, for 9 completely different reasons, and all of them still working while the fashionable choices from the same era have long since gone to scrap. I should say something that applies to every single one of these, not just 1 or 2 of them. Cheap and unreliable are not the same thing, no matter how often people treat them as synonyms when they're scrolling through listings. A car can be worth almost nothing on paper and still owe nobody an apology mechanically. In this specific corner of the automatic used market, that's closer to the rule than the exception, and it's been that way for longer than most buyers realize. What actually separates a brilliant purchase from a slow-motion disaster on any of these 9 isn't the badge, and it isn't really the mileage either. It's whether the automatic fluid was ever changed, and whether the history is honest rather than assumed. A high-mileage example with documented, unbroken servicing will consistently outlast a low-mileage example that spent years sitting still, seals drying out quietly while the odometer stayed flattering, and nobody was paying attention. If you take one thing from this entire list, take that one specifically. Every car here was built during a window when the badge either wasn't fashionable enough to matter, or had already fallen out of fashion entirely, and what was left underneath was an engineering team solving a practical problem properly, without anyone watching closely enough to notice. Next time you're scrolling through listings and something anonymous, unfashionable, or slightly embarrassing catches your eye at a price that feels too low to make sense, it might be worth a longer look than you'd normally give it. The automatics nobody wants are very often the ones that were never asking to be wanted in the first place, and that quiet indifference has kept them running long after everything louder gave up.